Demonstrates the standard procedures and good practices for the safe execution of hot work, as well as in confined working areas, and has the purpose of eliminating the danger of fires or gas ignitions during execution of hot work, eliminating the likelihood of workers being overcome by hazardous fumes and gases, as well as a lack of oxygen whilst working in confined spaces, appropriately managing and minimizing risks associated with working in confined spaces and execution of hot work. This video includes introduction, definitions, 5 steps to safe hot work execution, and confined space entry. Place and confined space related accidents are often devastating and can result in loss of life, serious injury, and major business disturbances. It must therefore be eliminated at all cost. Let us define some of the concepts and terminology. Hot work is any work that requires the use of an open flame or spark-producing apparatus. It includes, but is not limited to, welding, cutting, gouging, burning, grinding, lancing, or any heat-producing tasks that could ignite combustible materials or flammable atmospheres. Confined space is defined as areas that are large enough and so configured that a person can bodily enter and perform assigned work, is not designed for continuous people occupancy, is not exposed to natural ventilation, contains or has the potential to contain hazardous atmosphere such as gases or vapors, contains a material that has the potential to engulf an entrant, contains any other recognized safety or health hazards such as unguarded machinery, exposed live electrical wires, or heat stress, have walls that converge inward or floors that slope downward and taper into a smaller area which could trap or asphyxiate an entrant, has limited or restricted means of entry or exit, for example, tanks, vessels, silos, storage bins, trenches and sumps deeper than 2 meters, pipelines, dragline tubs, and revolving frame compartments. Hot work and confined space entry permits are 2 different written or printed permits issued by Anglo-American Thermal Coal. This authorizes safe entry into confined spaces and specified hot work at specific locations and time periods. Oxygen-deficient atmosphere is an atmosphere containing less than 19.5% oxygen by volume. Hazardous atmosphere is an atmosphere that may expose individuals to risk of death, incapacitation, impairment of ability to self-rescue, injury, or acute illness. Acceptable entry conditions are conditions that must exist in a permit space to allow entry and to ensure that individuals involved with a permit-required confined space entry can safely enter into and work within the space. The 5 steps to safe hot work execution and confined space entry are: mandatory procedural requirements, authorizing hot work execution and confined space entry, preparing for hot work execution and confined space entry, executing hot work and perform work in confined spaces, and post-hot work and confined space entry requirements. Mandatory procedural requirements. The engineering manager is responsible for the following mandatory procedural requirements: register of all identified confined spaces per plant or area, including category classification. Confined spaces will be clearly identified with appropriate signage. Confined space and hot work procedures and planned task observations. Formal risk assessments per individual confined space or class. Personnel list with competency to issue clearance certificates. Identification of work requirements, i.e. hot work, cleaning, and purging of confined spaces. Confined space entry permits and registers. Hot work permits and registers. a procedure to disable and restore fire protection systems during scheduled outages or breakdowns. Emergency evacuation and rescue procedure. Emergency rescue equipment and training certificates. Isolation and lockout procedure and register. Atmospheric testing and sampling equipment certificates and training records. Tools and equipment logbooks. Authorizing hot work execution and confined space entry. Authorization to execute hot work and to enter confined spaces include training, appointments, risk assessments, hot work and confined space entry permits. Only persons that are trained, qualified, competent, and fit to perform their duties will be allowed to execute hot work and enter confined spaces. Grinders must also be declared competent. This training ensures that individuals are equipped with the skills and knowledge to understand the hazards associated with hot work, working in confined spaces, the contents of permits, and the control measures implemented for their protection, which includes emergency procedures. All hot work operators must attend a training presentation, have passed the hot work assessment and planned task observation before being appointed and authorized by the responsible section engineer. A thorough formal risk assessment is required to identify all hazards, to assess potential loss events, and to identify required barriers. Risk assessments are to be reviewed whenever processes, people, or circumstances change. Identified energies include potential, kinetic, thermal, chemical, acoustic, vibrating energies. These energies could lead to the following significant risks: death by suffocation, fire or explosions, lack of oxygen, claustrophobia, burns, inundation of fluid, engulfment or drowning, toxic fumes or substances, insect and/or snake bites, buried under materials such as mud, coal or rock, electrocution. Permit systems are intended to ensure that individuals involved with hot work or who have to enter confined spaces are aware of the associated hazards and that control measures are implemented to mitigate the risks. The permit system provides a step-by-step checklist and reminds workers of the required legislation, safety precautions, and responsibilities before, during, and after task executions. It also enables Anglo-American thermal coal to keep track of hot work and confined space entry activities and ensures that these activities are being conducted safely. A permit to work and to enter confined spaces is issued with authorization by a responsible person in charge of the work to be carried out. It is important to note that permits expire after 24 hours. Hot work operations are strictly prohibited under the following conditions: in areas where a hot work permit is required but not obtained; in areas where a sprinkler or other fire suppression system is activated; in the presence of explosive atmospheres such as mixture of flammable gases, vapors, liquids or dust; in areas near to the storage of large quantities of flammable or combustible materials that can readily ignite; on any rim or components onto which a tire is fitted. Preparing for hot work execution and confined space entry. Preparation to execute hot work and to enter confined spaces includes isolation and lockout, emergency response plan, correct personal protective equipment, equipment inspections, confined space entry control, continuous risk assessment, SLAM, deactivate automatic fire suppression system, Barricade areas. Make safe of confined spaces. All sources of energy that might have a direct or indirect influence on the health and safety of persons in the confined space or working area must be isolated and locked out at the source by a responsible person, as per the Anglo-American Thermal Coal Isolation Fatal Risk Standard and procedures before commencement of any work. The keys are placed inside a lockable key cabinet. Every person locks the key cabinet with his own personal lock and fills in the lockout register with his personal details. The isolation procedure has further been established to prevent the introduction of contaminants or conditions through piping, ducts, vents, drains, conveyors, service pipes, etc. The activation or energizing of machinery inside and outside the confined space that could adversely affect the space. The release of any stored energy or potential energy in the plant, tools and equipment. An emergency response plan that was developed from a review of potential emergency scenarios must be in place and discussed before commencement of any work. When things go wrong in a confined space, people may be exposed to serious and immediate danger. Therefore, effective arrangements for raising the alarm and carrying out rescue operations in an emergency are essential. Ensure that there is additional fire suppression equipment available in the case of emergency, such as a fire tender on site during shutdowns. Another best practice is the commonly known dedicated position for fire extinguishers at a dragline shutdown. Additional fire extinguishers are positioned on the ground both sides of a dragline, next to the walking shoes and on deck, at both sides of the machinery house. The shutdown site layout plan also clearly identifies the position of all emergency response equipment. The correct personal protective equipment, also known as PPE, and respiratory protective equipment, RPE, as defined by the risk assessment and minimum site requirement, shall be used and maintained in a sanitary and reliable condition. PPE is issued against individuals' names. The scanning system provides accurate history and effectively controls cost. Minimum PPE site requirements for hot work execution include safety shoes, long leather spats over safety shoes with overall worn over the spats. Please take note that nylon-type overalls or jackets are not allowed. Long leather gloves, leather apron, dust mask, earplugs, fire-resistant skull cap with neck flap, face shield with goggles or welding helmet, lancing suit for lancing activities. The supervisor issuing the permit to work is responsible for the inspection and signing of equipment logbooks, the check for gas equipment leakage, damage to electrical and welding gables, and special attention is given to welding tongue hand grips. The supervisor further checks that all welding, cutting, and ventilation equipment is safe to use and signs off equipment logbooks. Minimum required safety equipment includes calibrated atmospheric testing equipment that can also measure, monitor, and alarm on flammable and hazardous gas, oxygen deficiency, and carbon monoxide exposure. Adequate fire extinguishing equipment. Effective means of communication to link the person in confined space or executing hot work with a spotter. First aid equipment. PPE and/or RPE suitable for the specific task. Barricades and no smoking signs. Portable lighting where required. Any other safety equipment identified by the risk assessment. Forced ventilation equipment where required. a lifeline is strongly recommended. Naked flame lighters such as matches or cigarette lighters are not permitted, and only friction-type lighters shall be used. Furthermore, only approved lights are to be used in confined spaces. Before work commences, workers execute a tool and equipment pre-use inspection. Entrances to confined spaces will be padlocked where possible, and appropriate signs displayed. Before work commences in confined spaces, signs are erected at all entrances to prevent entry of persons not involved in the work and who do not have the required permit to enter. People with valid confined space entry permits complete the confined space entry register. A good entry control practice used by the dragline shutdown team is a magnetic sticker system where individuals place a magnetic name tag on a board at the site office as well as at the point of entry. This system allows easy monitoring of people inside the confined space at any point in time. SLAM stands for Stop, Look, Assess, and Manage. People stop and take a few minutes to think about the tasks at hand. They look around and identify potential hazards. Questions are raised. Do we have the correct tools, and are they safe to use? How safe is our working area? They assess the level of risk for the identified hazards, and more questions are raised. Could something go wrong today? What could happen to me and the others? They all commit to the required actions to manage risk appropriately in order to prevent injury or damage to equipment. The supervisor also ensures that workers do not suffer from claustrophobia before entering confined spaces. A responsible person signs the automatic fire suppression register and deactivates the systems before the execution of any hot work to avoid accidental discharge of systems that might lead to lack of oxygen and result in suffocation. On completion of all work, the responsible person reactivates the automatic fire suppression systems and signs the register to confirm that fire protection systems are restored and reliable. Working areas are barricaded in such a way that there is no direct or indirect risk to the health and safety of personnel. Nearby personnel must also be suitably protected against heat, sparks, slag, etc. A spotter is required to ensure that people do not enter barricaded areas where hot work is being done, especially in the case of hot work overhead. Barricades carrying no smoking signs are required at every confined space entry. In the making safe of confined spaces, various means might be employed, such as forced ventilation, flushing with water, neutralizing harmful chemicals, etc. All covers and manholes must also be opened at least 30 minutes prior to entry. Carefully check the side of the manholes, tanks, and reservoirs. Remove all loose material to safeguard persons inside from falling objects. Access points must be kept free of any obstructions, such as leads, hoses, ventilation ducts, etc. When toxic fumes or gases may be present, like in sewer manholes, a competent person fully equipped with the appropriate respiratory equipment is to ensure the presence of sufficient oxygen to sustain life by carrying out atmospheric tests. It is vitally important to test for methane, carbon monoxide, and oxygen deficiency prior to entering holes or sumps. Acceptable entry conditions must first be achieved before entry to confined space can be permitted. The air we breathe normally contains 21% oxygen by volume, although oxygen levels of 19.5% to 23.5% by volume is considered to be safe. Some situations can cause the level of oxygen to dramatically decrease, leading to an oxygen-deficient atmosphere. Therefore, testing for these hazardous substances need to continue during the operation by the supervisor. Too much oxygen may also pose a risk to health and safety. Oxygen-enriched atmosphere can increase the risk of fire or explosion. Hot work and painting in confined spaces will only be permitted if the confined spaces are constantly ventilated by blower or extractor fans to achieve a minimum air velocity of 0.5 meters per second. Adequate firefighting equipment must be on hand and in good condition to contain and put out any fire that may occur within the working area. Beware of snakes, spiders, scorpions, or any other insects when entering trenches and confined spaces. All combustible and flammable material must be removed and working areas appropriately cleaned. Where combustible and flammable material cannot be removed, it must be wet down or covered with a non-combustible material or cover. Any exposed equipment, such as gearing, open shafts, gear cases, motors, electrical panels, etc., must be covered with a fire-resistant cover to prevent any damage during hot work execution. Consider and take the necessary precaution to avoid damage to equipment caused by heat that is generated by the hot work. Ensure that gas cylinders are secured in an upright position away from any heat source. To avoid gas explosions, welding preheating propane torches are not permitted in dragline tubs and revolving frames. Controlled preheating systems drastically reduce risk and provide a more effective heat control with printout records. Executing hot work and perform work in confined spaces. The following safety precautions shall be adhered to during hot work executions and performing work in confined spaces. Permit checklists, communication, standby person, frequent atmospheric tests, spotters, fire hazard-free conditions, reassess risk and restore safety conditions. Workers confirm that all items on the hot work and confined space entry permit checklists are complied with and signed off. A communication system is established to enable communication between people inside and outside the confined space, especially to summon help in an emergency. Communication can be achieved by radio, hand signals, or other suitable methods. Good continuous communication must be maintained with the spotter during hot work execution or confined space entry. A standby person is assigned to continuously monitor the well-being of those inside the confined space. The standby person with the authority to order people to exit the space in any hazardous situation will raise the alarm and should never enter the confined space to attempt rescue. Persons inside confined spaces must be withdrawn immediately when the presence of methane, carbon monoxide, or oxygen deficiency is detected. Testing and monitoring the atmosphere in confined spaces by a competent person using a suitable, correctly calibrated gas detector is a routine part of determining appropriate risk control. Atmosphere tests must be done in different levels, top, middle, and at the bottom. This is because contaminants can settle at different levels. Initial testing should be done from outside the confined space by inserting a sample probe. Atmosphere tests include airflow, oxygen content, airborne concentration of flammable or potentially harmful contaminant, for example hydrogen, sulfide, carbon monoxide, and methylene chloride. Never trust your own senses to determine if the atmosphere in confined space is safe. Many toxic or flammable gases and vapors cannot be seen or smelled, nor can the level of oxygen present be determined. A competent spotter fully equipped with protective equipment and 2 fire extinguishers is suitably positioned to monitor conditions and check for any possible fires caused by the hot work. In the case of a fire, spotters will immediately raise an alarm, stop the hot work operation, and assist with putting out the fire. Spotters also have the authority and responsibility to ensure that non-essential people are removed from the immediate work area, and further to keep people out of the barricaded working areas. Workers continuously clean working areas and maintain fire hazard-free conditions throughout the task execution. At regular intervals, the safety of the work area is reassessed and safety conditions restored when required. Post-hot work and confined space entry requirements. On completion of the work, the supervisor must conduct an inspection of the work area and systems to ensure that there is no smoldering for 30 minutes after hot work completion. Equipment is removed and working areas cleaned. All persons are clear and accounted for. All covers, guards and doors are in place and secured. Automatic fire suppression systems are reactivated and the register signed off. Permits cancelled and signed off by workers and supervisor. All safety equipment returned in good working order. Isolation and lockout removed. Confined space rescue drills shall be carried out annually, and records of these drills, with signatures of those who took part in the drill, will be kept by the immediate supervisor.